I became my girlfriend's toy and slave, and her best friend's amusement. Apologies if my English isn't perfect, it's not my first language, but I felt compelled to share this wild story. This is the story of how I, a fairly regular guy from Los Angeles, found myself caught in an intense, twisted web of power, control, and unexpected vulnerability. At 22, I was juggling the pressures of college with late-night bartending shifts in a bustling beachside bar. Life felt like it was on autopilot: class, work, bed, repeat. I spent most nights just trying to stay awake long enough to pass my exams. But then there was Karen. She was the spark in my otherwise routine life, the woman who made every dull moment seem thrilling. Karen was a knockout, and I felt like the luckiest guy alive to be with her. She was 23, and every bit as alluring as those girls on magazine covers. She had this golden blonde hair that seemed to catch the light, framing her face in waves, and her body was toned yet soft in the best ways. But her allure wasn't just her looks, it was her confidence, the way she carried herself like she owned any room she walked into. Men would turn to look at her, but she had eyes only for me, and that power was intoxicating. Our relationship was stable, or at least, that's what I believed. We were both busy, so we'd see each other a few times a week, mostly spending our weekends together. Our nights were intense, wrapped around each other in a mix of passion and genuine closeness. Occasionally, we'd play around with some light bondage, teasing each other with hints of dominance and submission. But, as open-minded as Karen was, she'd always drawn a line. I had desires, darker fantasies I kept tucked away, and I never pushed her for more, content with what we had, or so I thought. But it wasn't just Karen who stirred something in me. There was Eva, her best friend and roommate. Eva was Karen's opposite in so many ways, but the two of them fit together like puzzle pieces, a blend of light and dark. While Karen was flashy, always drawing attention, Eva was quiet, her beauty more mysterious. She had dark, shoulder-length hair and curves that were a bit fuller than Karen's, her body a testament to her dedication at the gym. I'd often see her in tight leggings, her toned legs and thick curves on full display, her face focused as she worked through her routines. There was something about her that pulled me in, a magnetic allure I couldn't resist, even if I knew better. Her calm confidence, her intense gaze, it all intrigued me, more than I cared to admit. It was that curiosity, that hidden desire, that eventually led me to the biggest mistake of my life. The moment that changed everything. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. Karen and Eva had gone out shopping, leaving me alone in their apartment. I remember walking around their living room, trailing my fingers over the furniture, breathing in the faint smell of Karen's perfume that lingered in the air. The quiet felt almost surreal, like a calm before a storm I didn't see coming. My eyes landed on a laundry basket, and before I knew it, I was rummaging through it. I pulled out a silk thong, bright red, delicate and soft to the touch. I felt a thrill just holding it, the forbidden nature of it making my heart race. I slipped it on, feeling the cool silk against my skin, the thrill of wearing something so intimate of hers. The shame mixed with excitement, leaving me feeling almost dizzy. And just then, as I was lost in that sensation, I heard the front door swing open. "What the hell are you doing?" The words hit me like a slap, Karen's voice sharp, filled with a venom I'd never heard before. She was standing in the doorway, her face twisted in shock and horror. Her blue eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open as she took in the sight before her. I froze, caught in the act, as she stared at me, disgust and rage flashing across her face. I could see her mind racing, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, her boyfriend standing there, naked except for her thong and clutching another one, which, to make it worse, I realized was Eva's. The disgust on her face deepened as her gaze shifted to the thong in my hand. "That's Eva's," she said, her voice low, trembling with fury. I opened my mouth to speak, to explain, but no words came out. I felt like I was drowning, the weight of her disgust pressing down on me, suffocating me. Without another word, she grabbed my arm and shoved me out of her apartment, the door slamming shut behind me. I stood there in the hallway, my face burning with shame, the full weight of what I'd done crashing down on me. Alone and ashamed, that night, I barely slept. I lay in my dark apartment, the silence pressing down on me, each second stretching longer than the last. I replayed the moment over and over, each detail stabbing into me like a blade, the humiliation fresh each time. I kept seeing Karen's face, twisted in disgust, hearing her voice filled with contempt. I felt like I'd lost everything, all for a brief, reckless thrill. But there was one thing I couldn't shake, the scent of Eva's panties. It clung to me, lingering in my mind like a ghost. I tried to push it away, to banish the memory, but it was no use. I kept thinking about Eva, her body, her quiet confidence, the way she moved, the way her leggings clung to her curves at the gym. The shame mixed with desire, creating a twisted cocktail of emotions that left me feeling hollow and desperate. I didn't want to give in, but the temptation was overwhelming. The scent, the image of Eva, the danger of it all, it was like a drug. And that night, as much as I hated myself, I gave in. I finished what I'd started, every moment filled with guilt and arousal, leaving me feeling empty and ashamed once the rush faded. The guilt was suffocating, and by the time morning came, I knew I had to do something to fix what I'd broken. The offer I couldn't refuse, desperate to make things right. I sent Karen a message, begging her to meet with me, hoping against hope that she'd be willing to listen. Hours passed with no response, each minute stretching longer than the last. Finally, a couple of hours into my shift at the bar, I saw her walk through the door. She looked breathtaking, every bit the queen she knew she was, her short pink dress clinging to her body, showing off her long, toned legs and her perfect curves. Every man in the bar turned to look at her, but her eyes were fixed on me, icy and unreadable. As she approached, the confidence in her stride was unmistakable, her heels clicking against the floor with each step. She leaned across the bar, her blue eyes piercing into mine with a look that was equal parts judgment and fury. The silence between us was tense, almost crackling with the weight of all that had happened. Finally, she broke the silence. "You want to talk? Fine. But from now on, we do things my way." Her voice was cool, authoritative, like she already knew she held all the power. The desperation in me was so intense I could barely form words. "Anything," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the bar. She smirked, a devilish smile that sent a shiver down my spine, a look that promised something darker than I was ready for. "You will regret saying that," she said, her tone laced with dark amusement. "Be at my place tomorrow at 1 p.m. Don't be late." Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my mind racing with fear and anticipation. The transformation begins. The next day, I stood outside Karen's apartment, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. When she opened the door, her expression was calm, almost unreadable, a stark contrast to the tension building in me. She invited me in, her voice curt and clipped, like I was a stranger rather than her boyfriend. She gestured to the couch, and I sat down, feeling like I was about to be judged in some kind of twisted court. She sat across from me, her gaze steady and unyielding, her posture cool and collected. She didn't waste any time. After a few moments of silence, she pulled out a small box from her bag and placed it on the table in front of me. Inside was a chastity cage, small and unassuming, but to me, it looked like a weapon. "You want to stay with me after what you did? Then you'll have to prove you deserve it," she said, her tone devoid of warmth. She held the cage out to me, her gaze daring me to refuse, her expression making it clear that this was no negotiation. I swallowed hard, the weight of her demand sinking in. She was serious. This wasn't just punishment, it was control, a way to make sure I could never cross a line again. I took the cage, my hands trembling as I looked at her, searching at her face for any sign of leniency, any hint that this was just a bluff. But Karen's eyes were steely, unyielding, and I knew there was no mercy here. She was in control now, and I was left with no choice but to submit. With a voice that was almost too calm, she gestured toward the bathroom. "Go prepare yourself," she instructed, her tone clinical, detached, as if she were discussing the weather rather than my surrender. I felt a wave of humiliation wash over me, the reality of what I was about to do sinking in. My heart pounded as I shut the bathroom door behind me and, hands trembling, followed her instructions. The mirror reflected my own flushed face, eyes wide with a mix of dread and excitement. I could barely recognize myself in that moment. When I returned to the living room, Karen's gaze didn't soften. In fact, her expression hardened, her authority almost palpable. She pointed to the spot in front of her, and with a dry throat, I approached, the small chastity cage clutched in my hand. Her instructions were simple, and each word she spoke only deepened my shame. "Drop your pants," she said, her voice flat, emotionless, as if she were issuing a simple request. I hesitated, but one stern look from her made it clear I wasn't in a position to resist. I slowly lowered my pants, feeling the cool air brush against my skin, intensifying my vulnerability. Karen stepped forward, reaching out with a steady hand, her gaze never leaving mine. She fit the chastity cage around me with a meticulous precision, the plastic pressing against me uncomfortably as she locked it in place. The final click of the lock felt like a sentence, sealing me into a new reality I hadn't expected. She stepped back, looking at me with a sense of satisfaction, as if she'd just won a game I didn't even realize we were playing. Just then, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me, and my stomach dropped. Eva walked into the room, her expression curious as she took in the sight before her. Her eyes moved slowly over me, lingering on the cage with a look of amused disbelief. "You really went through with it," she said, her voice tinged with mockery. A smirk tugged at her lips as she crossed her arms, her dark eyes glittering with a mix of intrigue and excitement. My face flushed even deeper, the shame nearly overwhelming as I realized that Eva was now part of this twisted game. Karen had brought her best friend in, making my humiliation complete. I stood there, half naked, feeling exposed and vulnerable as Eva circled me, her gaze appraising. She looked at Karen, her eyebrows raised, clearly impressed. "I didn't think he'd actually go through with it," she laughed, shaking her head. "Guess he really will do anything to keep you." Karen's smile widened, a predatory gleam in her eyes as she looked back at me. "Oh, he will," she replied, her voice soft but filled with an authority that made me shiver. She turned to Eva, her hand reaching up to touch the key that now hung around her neck like a trophy. "He's mine now," she said, her words sending a shockwave of realization through me. I wasn't just her boyfriend anymore, I was her possession, her plaything. Eva's gaze shifted to me, her expression softening just slightly, though her amusement never left her face. "And you're okay with this?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Part of me wanted to run, to escape this surreal nightmare, but another part of me felt a thrill at the idea of surrendering completely, of letting go and giving myself over to Karen's control. I nodded slowly, barely able to meet her gaze. "Good," Karen said, her voice breaking the silence, "because this is just the beginning." Days turned to weeks. The days that followed were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Karen kept me under her thumb, her control over me absolute. The chastity cage became a constant reminder of my submission, each uncomfortable moment a reminder of the power she held over me. She had rules now, and she enforced them with a strictness that left no room for negotiation. I was to be at her beck and call, fulfilling her every whim, and if I disobeyed or hesitated, there were consequences. One evening, Karen called me over to her place after my shift. I arrived to find her sitting on the couch, Eva beside her, both of them sipping wine and laughing about something I couldn't hear. Karen's eyes lit up when she saw me, her smile widening. She gestured for me to sit on the floor in front of them, a position that only heightened my sense of vulnerability. I obeyed, my face burning with humiliation as I lowered myself to the ground, my eyes cast downward. Eva looked at me with a mix of amusement and curiosity, clearly fascinated by the dynamic that had developed between Karen and me. She leaned in, her voice low and teasing. "So, Karen tells me you're quite the obedient little thing now," she murmured, her eyes sparkling with mischief. My face turned crimson as I nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Karen laughed, reaching out to stroke my cheek, her touch both affectionate and possessive. "Oh, he's been very good," she replied, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "He'll do anything I ask, won't you, love?" Her hand moved to the key around her neck, and I felt a surge of shame and excitement at the reminder of my captivity. I nodded, my voice barely a whisper as I replied, "Yes, anything." Eva raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Anything, huh?" she asked, her tone playful. She looked at Karen, a question lingering in her gaze. "Mind if I test that?" Karen smirked, her gaze flicking between me and Eva. "Be my guest," she replied, her voice light with amusement. She settled back against the couch, watching, with an intensity that made my heart race. Eva leaned forward, her gaze locking onto mine as she issued her first command. "Kneel," she said, her voice firm. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I obeyed, lowering myself to my knees in front of her. She looked down at me, a small smile playing on her lips as she reached out to touch my cheek, her fingers warm against my skin. "You really are at her mercy," she murmured, her voice soft but laced with a hint of condescension. "And now, you're at mine too." She let her hand linger for a moment before pulling back, leaving me feeling both humiliated and exhilarated. For weeks, this became my new reality. Karen and Eva would summon me, testing my limits, pushing me further into submission. Each time, I felt my old self slipping away, replaced by a new version of me, one who was willing to do anything to stay in Karen's good graces. And each time, I felt the weight of my submission more acutely, a mixture of shame and strange satisfaction. Breaking point, but as the weeks went on, the intensity of their control began to wear on me. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, my life revolving entirely around their demands and whims. I barely recognized myself anymore, and yet I was trapped, bound by my desire for Karen and the strange satisfaction I found in surrendering to her. It was a twisted cycle, one I didn't know how to escape. One night, after an especially humiliating session, I found myself lying alone in my apartment, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was really what I wanted. The thrill was gone, replaced by a deep sense of emptiness. I missed the days when I'd felt like an equal in my relationship, when I'd been able to look Karen in the eye without feeling like her possession. But now, I didn't know if I'd ever get that back. I decided to confront Karen, to tell her that I couldn't go on like this. The next day, I went to her apartment, my heart heavy with dread and determination. She opened the door, her expression softening slightly as she saw me, but I could see the flicker of dominance still in her eyes. "Karen," I began, my voice shaking. "I can't keep doing this. I want to go back to the way things were." Her smile faded, replaced by a look of disappointment. "Oh, is that so?" she replied, her voice cold. She reached up, her fingers brushing against the key around her neck. "You think you can just walk away?" I felt a surge of fear as her words sank in, realizing just how deeply I'd entangled myself in her control. But I stood my ground, my voice firm. "Yes. I want my freedom back." For a long moment, she stared at me, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she sighed, her fingers closing around the key. "Fine," she said, her voice icy. She unlocked the chastity cage, the final barrier between me and my freedom. But as I walked out of her apartment, a part of me felt a strange pang of loss, a hollow ache where my submission had once been. In the end, I'd gained my freedom, but at what cost?